In this video, I'm going to be showing you a different way to handle your state management in your React applications. We're not going to be using the traditional state management libraries like Redux, Zastan, Mobex, and all the other ones. We're going to be using something else. We're still going to be using a library, just not one that you would typically expect to be used for state management. So get ready, get excited, because this is going to be a great video, and I promise you, you are going to learn a lot. And by the way, speaking of learning, if you want to learn how to build a big and complex application with React as a total beginner with no prior experience, check out Project React in the description. I promise you, you will not regret it. Let's get into it. All right, so let's begin. Over here, as usual, I have a super simple application with literally nothing on it, and we're going to implement, and I'm going to show you a really cool way to handle your state management in React. Now, like I said in the introduction video, we're not going to be using any of the traditional state management libraries like Redux, Zastan, Mobex, and all of those. We're going to be using something else. And what we're going to be using for this is going to be over here, ta-da, is going to be TanStack Query, otherwise known as React Query. We're going to be using React Query to implement a very simple yet very powerful state management solution in our application that is equal to something that you would see in Redux or Zastan, for example. And the reason we're able to do this is because, contrary to popular belief, a lot of developers don't know this, but React Query or TanStack Query is not just for data fetching. It's not a data fetching library. While it can be used for data fetching, and arguably that is the most common use case that many developers have with TanStack Query, as you can see over here, it is a powerful asynchronous state management solution for React, Solid, Vue, Svelte, and so on. We're only obviously focused on React. But the important key here is that it's a powerful asynchronous state management. It doesn't say data fetching, it says asynchronous state management. So state management that deals with asynchronous functions, asynchronous tasks, which is great for us because we want to use this to create a state management solution. This is perfect. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how you can use TanStack Query for state management in a way that is super simple, super efficient, and it can actually scale to a really complex application if you choose to. You don't have to do it this way, but if you want to, you can, because this is a great solution. Again, it is made specifically for asynchronous state management. Now, before I actually start implementing all of this code, I just want to take a moment to really think about what are we actually doing here with this video, right? What we're doing is something called learning by doing. I'm not just giving you theory. I'm not just giving you a lecture. I'm actually showing you and implementing this in front of you, and arguably we're implementing this together, and I'm showing you a real world example of how you would manage state management with React Query by actually showing you the implementation. This is called learning by doing, and it's a super effective approach, and that's the approach that Brilliant, the sponsor of this video, is actually taking. So Brilliant is a place where you actually learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in various topics such as math, data analytics, AI, and more importantly for us, of course, programming. Brilliant has a learning platform that is designed to be uniquely effective. Each lesson has you solve problems using a hands-on approach that lets you play and get a feel for the different concepts, which actually has been proven to be 6 times more effective than watching simple lecture videos. Plus, all of the content on Brilliant is crafted by an award-winning team of researchers and professionals from places like MIT, Microsoft, Google, and so much more. Brilliant literally helps you build your critical skills through problem solving, which is something that we do on a daily basis as software developers as opposed to memorizing. So while you're building real knowledge on specific topics, you're also learning to become a better thinker. And Brilliant helps you do that with literally just a couple of minutes per day. They have super fun lessons that you can do whenever you have the time. It's literally the opposite of mindless scrolling, and it actually builds a great habit. And if you want a suggestion of a great course to take on Brilliant, check out Thinking in Code, which follows pretty much the same principles we're doing in this video and teaches you solid foundations for computer science, which will help you a lot as a React developer. Try everything that Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days. Visit brilliant.org/cosmsolutions or click the link in the description. You're also going to get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thank you once again to Brilliant for sponsoring this video, and now we can actually start implementing state management using React Query. Let's get into it. All right, so the first thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to come here in my sidebar, and I'm going to make a new folder inside of the SRC folder, and we're going to call this folder state. This folder is going to contain every file and thing that we need to implement our state management solution with React Query. And inside, the first file that I'm going to do is index.ts. This is going to be our main file. And in here, we're going to create one function that is going to be our state creator function. This is going to handle all of the logic of creating a piece of state. And then we're going to use that function in another file still in this folder to create individual pieces of state that we can then use in our application and share between different components. So we're going to do export function create global state. That is going to be a function that importantly is going to return another function, which we're going to leave it empty for now, right? So again, this is going to be a function that we're going to use to create global states, to create individual global states. Those are also going to be functions, and those are the functions that we're going to use in the individual components. And all of the logic is going to go inside of here, inside of this inner function. This is going to hold all of the code that is related to state management with React Query. So the first thing that we want to write in here is because we're going to be manipulating data inside of the query cache of React Query, because all of this is going to be done using the cache of React Query, we're going to want to access the query client to have it available inside of this function to use. So we're going to do const query client equals use query client, import this from tanstack at React Query like so, and now we're going to have access to this query client inside of this function. The only reason that this is going to work, because as you can see here, this starts with use, which means it's a custom hook, is because this function is the one that is going to end up getting used inside of each individual component, and it's going to be used as a custom hook, which gives us the ability to put other custom hooks in here because that follows the rules of hooks, right? So that's an important distinction to make. This function over here is going to end up being used as a custom hook inside of a component, which means that we can do all of the logic using React Query inside of here safely. Then after that, we're going to come here and we're actually going to make use of the popular, the most common hook from React Query, which is use query. So what we're going to do is we're going to do const and then data like this to access the data from React Query. Then we're going to do use query like this, import this from React Query like so. And now this takes in a few parameters. For example, we're going to need the query key like this, right? Now, what is the query key? Where is this query key going to come from? Well, the place that makes the most sense for us is to actually have the query key be a parameter of this function. So when we create an individual piece of state, we're going to call this function, we're going to pass it a query key, and that is the query key that is going to get used inside of this hook right here. So what we can do is we can do query key like this, and I'm going to type this as unknown, just because that is the type of the query key whenever you're using React Query. If I hover over this over here, you see here we have query key. Let's go here to this one, query key, and that is going to be query key. There we go. Query key is a read-only array of unknown. So actually it's an array, right? So over here, we're going to do like this. We're going to pass it as an array, query key like this, right? The actual property that you pass to use query has to be an array. But for our case, for simplicity, we're just going to have this be a unknown, which is really going to be a string. And we're going to pass it manually inside of an array. If you want to add more functionality to this in the future to actually customize this and maybe have this be here an array of unknown, so we're going to do this. You can also do this, and then you wouldn't have to pass it like this as well, where you can also do this. This would also make sense if you want to pass options or properties to this query and have them be inside of the query key. You would also pass them in this way directly. And in that case, I believe you can just do something like this. You can do, let's see, query key and import this from tanstack query, and then that is going to be the actual type. But this one, as you can see, it is a read-only array of unknown, right? So it's ultimately the same exact thing, right? We're not going to do it this way. We're just going to keep things simple. We're just going to have this be unknown, and it's going to be a string, and we're going to pass it directly like so with no further customization. Then the second thing that we need is the query function, the actual function that is going to return some data asynchronously, right? Because remember, React Query is an asynchronous state management library, so we need to work with asynchronous functions. So what we're going to do here is we're going to do query fn, and that is going to be an arrow function. And here I'm going to return a promise dot resolve, right? Because we're not actually going to be fetching any data. We're just going to return directly a promise that is going to resolve with some data. And whatever data we put in here is the data that is going to go inside of the React Query cache for us to use inside of our application. Now this data over here, where is it and where is it going to come from? Well, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to put it as an argument to this function because it does make sense that whoever uses this function to create an individual piece of state should also have the ability to set initial data in the state. And then we're also going to use that initial data because we're passing it here inside of this function to also allow easily resetting the state to that initial data at the click of a button through a function that we're going to create inside of this. So what we're going to do here is we're going to come and we're going to do initial data like this. And now this also needs a type. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make use of TypeScript generics to have a really cool type for this without actually specifying the type inside of this function directly. So I'm going to come here and I'm going to make T for a generic type. And then we're going to have initial data be T or null, because we want this initial data to also be optionable to null. And then we're going to make it equal to null. In case this isn't provided, this is going to be an optional. We're going to default this to null. If it is provided, it's going to be of type T. And this is going to come from whoever is using this function to actually create the individual piece of state. And then we're going to take this initial data and then we're just going to put it here inside of the resolve. We're going to do initial data like this. And now as soon as this useQuery hook actually mounts, it's going to run this function and it's going to put this initial data in the cache of React Query, and it's going to come up here in this data variable right here. And as you can see, our data here is awaited T or null or undefined, right? Undefined because initially when React Query first starts, it is going to be undefined. Then it's going to switch when it actually runs this function and gets the data. It's going to be awaited T. Otherwise, if we provide a null, it is going to be null, right? So this makes perfect sense. So now with this, we can actually just return the data inside of an object like this, and we have a basic working version of some state management in React. We're going to be able to use this function to create a global state, specify a query key and some initial data, and then we're going to have access to that data directly inside of any component that we use. But we're not done. We still have a bit more work to do to this function before we can start using it to actually create our individual pieces of state. The first thing that we want to do is, because React Query is usually used for data fetching, it also has a lot of defaults that we don't want to have here. For example, refetching, right? We don't want to do any automatic refetching, such that refetching on background, refetching when you regain connection, right? Which are all defaults that React Query has. We want to disable all of those because we want to manually control when this data gets refetched, because again, we're not using this as a data fetching solution. We're just using it as a store of data, and we want to control when we update that data and not have React Query try to do this automatically in the background. So for this, I'm just going to paste here some configuration that I have. It's nothing too fancy. It's just disabling all of the refetches, the different refetches of React Query. So refetch interval, on mount, on window focus, on reconnect. We're going to set all of those to false, and we're going to manually control when this data gets updated. And now with this, the only thing left that we have to do is actually create one function to set the data, since we're not controlling that manually, and one function to reset the data to put it back to initial data, and then we're done. We just return those two functions and we have our working state management solution in React Query. So let's do it. So first we're going to come here, we're going to do function set data, and that is going to take in a data property over here, which is going to be partial of type T. And the reason we're doing this, let me just close out the function to get rid of the error. The reason we're doing partial T is because we already have the type of the initial data over here, T. So that is going to be the type of the data that can be stored in this specific instance of that state. And then when we're setting the data, well, it makes sense for us to allow partially setting that data. Maybe we just want to update one property, two properties, or all properties. All of that is going to work if we use this partial. If we didn't use partial over here, then we would require that every time we set the data, we set it with all of the properties inside of the object or whatever it is. And we don't want that. We want this to be partial because we want to allow partial updates to our state. That just makes sense. And then the only thing that we're going to do is we're going to do query client and then set query data. And then we're going to pass it here the query key. And we're going to do here data like this, right? Close out here, and there we go. That is the only thing that we need to actually set data inside of our query cache. Remember, all of this is possible because React Query works as an asynchronous state management solution, and we're using the cache for that. Everything that you do in React Query, when this function, for example, first gets executed, the result of initial data is going to actually get set in the cache of React Query, which is this data object over here. So we're going to be able to use that to actually access our data. If we want to update that data, we just set the query data, pass it the query key, and pass it the data that we want to set, and that is going to work. That is all that we need, right? I told you this was going to be super simple. And then the last thing that we need is the function to reset the data, and this one as well is going to be super simple. We're going to do function reset data. That is going to take in no arguments, and the only thing we're going to do is query client dot invalidate queries. So we're going to invalidate the cache of those queries, and this one takes in a query key like this. So we're just going to give this an object query key like this. and we're going to pass it the same query key like this. So we're going to invalidate the queries, and then we're going to take this entire thing, paste it again, and we're going to refetch the queries of that query key like so, right? So to reset the data, we're just invalidating everything. We're calling refetch manually, right? Which is not actually going to perform a fetch, but it is going to run this query function again. That is going to resolve with the initial data, and that is going to put that inside of the state, effectively resetting our state to its initial data, right? Two functions, super simple, but they accomplish everything that we need for state management in React. And now the only thing that we have to do is just return the functions. So set data and then reset data. And now we're able to use this inside of our component to actually manipulate and access the data that is used inside of the state. And really, this is all that we need. One function to create a global state. It returns another function with all of the logic from React Query to actually handle our state. And then it just returns all of the logic over here. We have the query client over here. We have the actual use query hook, which basically is used to set our data initially. And then we have one function to set the data, one function to reset the data. And that is all that we need to set, to reset, and to actually access the data. So now let's create one individual piece of state to see how we can actually use this in a real application. So I'm going to come here to the sidebar. I'm going to create a new file inside of the state folder, and we're going to call this user.ts like so. So this is going to be state and then user. And here we're going to create our user state. And again, this is similar to something that you would do in Redux or Mobex or Zustand. You would create individual pieces of state with their state variables, their own functions, and you would then export those and use those inside of your components. So because we are working in TypeScript, the first thing that we always do is we create the type of our user state. So we're going to do type user state like this. That is going to be equal, and I'm just going to put something like name and then string, and then let's say is signed in, and then boolean like so, right? Pretty simple. We're not going to go any in depth with that. And then we're going to use this create global state to create our new function, our new custom hook that we can then use inside of a component. So we're going to do export const use user state. We're putting use here because this is going to be used as a custom hook, and that is going to be equal to create global state. We're going to import this from dot over here from the index file. We're going to give this here user state as a state, and then we're going to call this with the query key as user, for example, and then initial data over here. If we want to have any initial data, which let's say that we do, we want to give this here name, and then we're going to put, for example, Darius like so, and then is signed in. We're going to put this to true, and there we go. We see that we have no type errors because the type of this object over here of this initial data is getting inferred from this type over here of user state. That is what this T over here does, right? In this case, it was a T, it was a generic. In this case, we told it it's user state, so it knows that this is the object that it should receive. And now with this, we have use user state, which is a function, right? As you can see here, this is a function because this create global state is returning a function. So this is the actual function that it is. And we're calling it as use user state, which means it's a custom hook, which means that here inside of it, we're allowed to use all of these hooks. That's the only reason why this works. And then we can take this function and we can actually use it in our components. So let's come here to app, and let's come here. Let's remove all of this text, and let's do const data. And then we're going to do use user state, import this directly. And here I'm just going to call this just data like so. We're going to leave this, and then we're going to put here data question mark dot name, and you see everything is automatically typed. We have type inference, which is great. I'm going to put it here and see what pops up on the screen. Actually, maybe let's put an h1 tag and then do class name text XL and then font bold, just to make it a little bit easier for us to see. Let's come here, put this here and save. And let's now go back to our application and see what we actually have. There we go. We have Darius. We have this value that is coming directly from React Query through our custom state management solution inside of our React component, ready for us to use. Isn't that great? I mean, we did all of this with literally a few lines of code, right? The only code that we have is this creator function over here, which we can use as many times as we want for as many states as we want. And then we created our individual user state. We gave it some default value, and then we're able to use those directly inside of our components. And what I can also do is I can come here, I can make another component function, for example, user card. And that is going to be a component that just returns, for now, let's see what we return. I can also use the same hook inside of this component, which is a separate component, right? It shouldn't technically have access to this, but because it is a custom hook and because we're using the React Query cache, we're going to get the same data back. We can also take this entire thing, we can put it here, and we can put this H1, for example, in here directly, right? And then here we're going to use the user card component. like this. And now I can actually remove this, but I'm going to keep this. If we go back to our application, we have the same thing again, right? We're using this custom hook inside of this component over here, and we're getting access to it there, which means that instead of data, we can maybe access set data, right? Use this function and then update the data inside of this component, inside of this app component, and see the data be updated inside of the user card component. So for example, if we had an input over here, right, and we did on change, we took the event and then we did set data, and then we did name e.target.value, so that on change we're actually changing the data of that, right? And then when I come over here back to our application, we have this input over here. If I do something like test, as I'm typing, you see that it's changing directly the contents of the cache, right? It's changing cache. There you go, of the cache. As I'm typing, you can't see it here because the input is not styled, but you get, I'm actually typing on an input. As I'm typing on the input, the actual text over here that, remember, is inside of a different component through this data property over here is getting updated by this set data function, right? Isn't that super cool? And then I can take this button over here, a button, and I can do on click. And here we're going to make use of the reset data. And then we're going to do on click equals reset data. This takes no argument, so this is fine. We're going to need to do reset over here like this, and then close the button. And now we have a button to reset the data. When I press reset, it goes back to Darius because that was the initial data that we set, right? This is really cool because that allows us to set any data that we want over here, use this inside of our initial state, and then through the logic that we built over here, we can actually update that data and everything works exactly as we want. And if we want to customize this further, if we want to add more things over here, options or different functions, we can do that. And all of those functions would then be available in our components through the use of all of these individual hooks. This is really cool. Now, the question that you might have is, should you use this? Should you go out now and use this in your own applications as opposed to using something like Redux or Zustand or any other traditional state management solution? And the real answer is, it depends. It depends on the project. It depends on what your goals are with the project, the size of the project, and ultimately if this use case fits the project or if it doesn't. If you're just playing around, you want to try this out, you want to get more familiar with React Query, by all means go for it. If your state management needs are relatively simple and or you're using React Query already for data fetching, then this makes a lot of sense because this is a natural extension to something that you already have and you're already using inside of your project. Now, on the other hand, if you're building a really complex application with really complex state and a lot of moving parts, maybe this isn't necessarily the best solution because you would have to code a lot of that functionality yourself and put this in here when something like Redux or Zustand already has it in place and you can just use that and save yourself a lot of time. Plus, also, you might make mistakes if you code it on your own, and if you use something that's already tested, that's already out there, the chances of mistakes or bugs that you can't control are a lot less. And generally, if you're building a project at a larger scale, it's more recommended to go for something that is more stable and ultimately more safe for the project. But honestly, I would highly recommend that you take out this repo. It's going to be a link in the description to access the code over here that you see and actually play around with this and see what cool things you can do with it. See what kind of things you can actually add to this, because this is a great learning opportunity, again, to something that you're probably already using in your project. If you're doing any sort of data fetching that is not server component based, you're probably going to be using React Query. It is the standard. So working with this is going to give you a really fundamental understanding of React Query and how you can use it for things that are not necessarily just data fetching. So really, I would recommend that you do this. Check out the link in the description, the repository for this code, play around with it. It's going to give you a really good fundamental understanding of React Query, and it's ultimately going to make you a better developer. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more videos just like this one, make sure to leave this video a big thumbs up. You can also click here to subscribe, or you can click here to watch a different video of mine that YouTube seems to think that you're really going to enjoy. My name has been Darius Kozdan. This is Kozdan Solutions. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you to Brilliant for sponsoring this segment of the video, and I will see you in the next video. Ciao, ciao.